The restaurant was fancier than anywhere I usually ate, but Emma had insisted we meet her fiancé's family at this upscale place downtown. I'd put on my best shirt and tie, hoping to make a good impression on the people who would soon be part of our family. When we arrived, Emma immediately began introducing everyone around the table. "This is my fiancé, Marcus, and his wonderful parents, Mr. and Mrs. Thornfield." She gestured to Marcus's sister next. "And this is Patricia, Marcus's sister, and her husband Kevin." I waited for my turn, standing there with a smile ready, but Emma kept talking about the appetizers and how lovely the restaurant was. The silence stretched on as I realized she was deliberately avoiding introducing me. Finally, Marcus's mother spoke up. "And who is this gentleman with you, dear?" Emma's cheeks flushed slightly. "Oh, this is just a family friend. He's been helping with some wedding preparations." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Family friend. After 26 years of raising her alone, of being there for every scraped knee, every broken heart, every triumph and failure, I was just a family friend. The in-laws exchanged knowing smirks, and I felt my heart sink into my shoes. I forced a smile and sat down quietly, trying to hide the hurt that was burning in my chest. Emma avoided looking at me for the rest of the dinner, focusing all her attention on Marcus and his family. The Thornfields were everything I wasn't: wealthy, polished, speaking in that careful way that came from expensive educations and country club memberships. Mrs. Thornfield's jewelry probably cost more than I made in 6 months, and Mr. Thornfield kept mentioning business deals and investment opportunities. "Emma fits in so perfectly with our family," Mrs. Thornfield said, patting my daughter's hand. "She has such refinement, such class. It's wonderful to see young people who understand the importance of proper social circles." I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to collect myself. When I returned, I caught the tail end of their whispered conversation. "Poor thing, having to bring along charity cases," Mrs. Thornfield was saying quietly. "Well, at least she knows her place now," Mr. Thornfield replied. "Once she's part of our family, she won't need to associate with people who lack proper status." Marcus nodded along, not defending me or questioning their cruel assumptions about who I was. Emma sat there silently, letting them talk about me like I was some burden she had to carry. The humiliation was complete. After we left the restaurant, I drove Emma home in silence. Finally, I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Emma, why didn't you introduce me as your father?" She stared out the passenger window, her jaw tight. "Dad, please don't make this harder than it already is." "Harder than what?" "I'm your father. I raised you. I love you." She turned to face me then, and the look in her eyes was something I'd never seen before, embarrassment mixed with frustration. "You wouldn't understand their world, Dad. You just embarrass me," she said, her voice sharp. "Look at you. Look at your old car, your cheap clothes, your job-fixing air conditioners. Marcus's family has standards." Each word was like a knife cutting deeper. "I worked 3 jobs to put you through college. I gave up everything to make sure you had opportunities one never had. And I'm grateful for that," she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. "But this is different. This is my future. I can't have you ruining it because you don't understand how to act around successful people." I pulled into her driveway and sat there as she got out. My heart was completely shattered. The little girl who used to call me her hero now saw me as an embarrassment to be hidden away. "I'm sorry I'm such a disappointment to you," I said quietly. She didn't even look back. The next week, Mrs. Thornfield cornered me at the grocery store. I tried to smile and be polite, but she had other plans. "I think we need to have a little chat," she said, steering me toward a quiet corner of the produce section. "About your relationship with Emma." She looked me up and down with obvious disdain, taking in my worn work jacket and practical shoes. "I want to be clear about something. My son comes from a very important family. We have a reputation to maintain, connections to preserve." "I understand," I said, though I wasn't sure I did. "Do you?" "Because I don't think Emma realizes what she's getting into, marrying into our world. There will be charity galas, business dinners, social events where appearances matter. She leaned closer. Frankly, her background is already going to be difficult enough to explain. The insult was clear. What are you saying? I'm saying that Marcus deserves better than a family like yours. Emma understands this, which is why she's been so careful about how she presents herself to us. She knows that some connections are better left unnamed. She adjusted her expensive purse and gave me one final look of disgust. I trust you'll be understanding about your place in all of this. For Emma's sake, of course. She walked away, leaving me standing there feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. That evening, I stopped by Emma's apartment to drop off some documents she needed for the wedding planning. I knocked, but there was no answer, so I used the spare key she'd given me years ago. I could hear voices coming from the living room: Emma, Marcus, and Mrs. Thornfield discussing wedding arrangements. I was about to announce myself when I heard Marcus laughing. "Mom, you worry too much about her dad," he was saying. "It's not like he's going to be a problem. Emma's already handling that situation." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Thornfield asked. "She's been distancing herself from him for months, making excuses about why he can't come to family events, why he's not involved in the wedding planning. Don't worry, she won't bring her dad around too much after we're married. He doesn't fit in with the kind of life we're building." Emma's voice was quiet but clear. "It's better this way. He's a good man, but he just doesn't understand this world. It would be uncomfortable for everyone." "Exactly," Marcus agreed. "After the wedding, she'll really be part of our family. The old connections won't matter anymore." I stood in the hallway, listening to my daughter plan my exile from her life like it was just another item on a wedding checklist. They were talking about me like I was a problem to be managed, an embarrassment to be minimized. I left the documents on the kitchen counter and walked out without a word. That night, I sat in my small living room and pulled out the old photo albums. There, in faded color photographs, was the evidence of a different time, when Emma thought I was the most important person in her world. Emma at age 3 riding on my shoulders at the county fair. Emma at 7, gap-toothed and grinning as I helped her learn to ride a bike. Emma at 16, crying on my shoulder after her first heartbreak, telling me I was the only person who understood her. I stopped at my favorite photo, Emma's high school graduation. She was wearing her cap and gown, beaming with pride, and I was next to her with the biggest smile I'd ever had. In the background, you could see my beat-up truck, the one I'd driven for 15 years because every extra dollar went to her college fund. "Thank you, Daddy," she'd said that day. "I couldn't have done any of this without you. You're my hero." I traced her young face with my finger, remembering the promises I'd made to her mother before she died. I'd sworn I would protect Emma, give her every opportunity, be the father she deserved. Had I failed her? Had I been so focused on providing for her that I'd forgotten to prepare her for a world where love mattered less than appearances? Or had she simply outgrown her need for a father who fixed air conditioners and drove old trucks? The next morning, I started making phone calls from my home office. Emma assumed I was retreating in shame, accepting my reduced role in her life. She had no idea that I was quietly putting a different plan into motion. My first call was to my old friend Charlie, who worked at the courthouse. We'd known each other for 20 years, and he owed me more than one favor. "Charlie, it's Frank. I need you to do some checking for me." Quietly. "Sure, Frank. What's going on?" "I need you to look into the Thornfield family. Business licenses, property records, court filings. Anything public record." There was a pause. "You in some kind of trouble?" "Not me. But I think my daughter might be. Can you do it without anyone knowing? Give me a few days. I'll see what I can dig up." My second call was to my banker, Mrs. Peterson, who'd been handling my accounts for 15 years. We had a long conversation about liquidating some investments I'd been keeping quiet, converting assets that most people didn't know I had. My third call was to my lawyer, discussing options I'd never thought I'd need to consider. Emma thought I was sulking in my corner, beaten down by her rejection. She had no idea that her old man was about to remind everyone involved exactly who they were dealing with. 2 weeks later, The Thornfields invited me to their house to discuss wedding arrangements. I should have known it wasn't really an invitation. It was a summons. Their home was everything I'd expected. Massive, perfectly decorated, with that cold elegance that screamed money. Mrs. Thornfield served tea in china cups that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "We've been discussing the guest list," Mr. Thornfield began, sliding a paper across their mahogany coffee table. "And we want to make sure everyone is comfortable at the ceremony." I looked at the list. There were maybe 8 names from my side, mostly Emma's distant cousins and a few old family friends. The Thornfield side took up 3 full pages. "We've limited your guest list to immediate family only," Mrs. Thornfield explained, her tone suggesting this was a generous compromise. "We felt it would be more appropriate, given the size of the venue and the style of celebration we're planning." The message was clear. My people weren't good enough for their fancy wedding. "Of course," I said, nodding politely. "Whatever Emma wants." They exchanged satisfied glances. Mr. Thornfield leaned forward. "We're so pleased that you understand the situation, Frank. Some parents have difficulty accepting when their children move into different social circles." "I just want Emma to be happy," I replied. "Wonderful. We knew we could count on your cooperation." I signed their revised guest list without argument, letting them think they'd won another battle. But I was fighting a different war entirely. The worst moment came during Emma's final dress fitting. I'd driven her to the boutique, and while she was trying on her gown, I waited in the front area with the other mothers and family members. When Emma emerged in her wedding dress, she looked absolutely radiant. For a moment, I forgot all the hurt and just felt pride in the beautiful woman my little girl had become. "You look perfect, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick with emotion. The other women in the boutique murmured their agreement, and Emma smiled. But then her expression changed, like she suddenly remembered she was supposed to be embarrassed by me. She walked over to where I was sitting and leaned down, speaking quietly so only I could hear. "Please, Dad, just don't say too much at the wedding, okay? The Thornfields have very specific expectations about how things should be handled." Her words sliced through me like a blade. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe let Marcus's family take the lead on the speeches and the toasts. They're better at that kind of formal thing." She glanced around nervously. "And maybe try not to tell those embarrassing stories about when I was little. You know how you get emotional." I stared at my daughter, beautiful in her white dress, asking me to make myself invisible on the most important day of her life. "I understand," I said quietly. She squeezed my shoulder, probably thinking she was being kind. "Thanks, Dad. I knew you'd understand." Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into work, staying late at the shop and claiming I was too busy to help with wedding errands. Emma seemed relieved that I was keeping my distance, which told me everything I needed to know about how much she wanted me involved. But I wasn't really working late. I was meeting with people, making arrangements, putting pieces in place for something much bigger than anyone expected. Charlie had come through with his research on the Thornfields, and what he'd found was very interesting. There were some concerning patterns in their business dealings, some questionable financial transactions that deserved closer scrutiny. My lawyer had helped me organize my affairs in a way that would make certain revelations possible when the time was right. And I'd had several long conversations with people from my past, people Emma had forgotten about, but who remembered exactly who I was and what I'd accomplished over the years. Every night, I worked on a special project in my garage, something that would serve as the centerpiece for my daughter's wedding day surprise. Emma called a few times to check on me, probably worried that I was falling apart. "Are you okay, Dad? You seem so distant lately." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just giving you space to focus on your wedding planning." "I appreciate that. I know this transition is hard, but it's for the best." Transition. Like I was being transferred to a different department instead of being written out of her life entirely. The wedding rehearsal was held at the Thornfields Country Club, a place so exclusive that I felt like security might escort me out just for walking through the door. Everything was perfect, the flowers, the music, the seating arrangements that carefully separated my few guests from their many important friends. After the run-through, the Thornfields asked to speak with me privately in the club's library. I knew what was coming. "Frank," Mr. Thornfield began, settling into a leather chair like he was holding court. "We've been thinking about the ceremony tomorrow. Specifically, about the tradition of walking the bride down the aisle," Mrs. Thornfield added, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Marcus was there too, nodding along like he'd been part of this conversation from the beginning. "The thing is," Mrs. Thornfield continued, "given Emma's new position in society, and considering the importance of the families we'll be joining together, well, we think it would be best if someone more appropriate handled that honor." The words hung in the air like poison. "We've arranged for Emma's uncle to step in," Mr. Thornfield explained. "He's a judge, very well respected in the community. It would make a better impression on our guests." I looked at the three of them, sitting there so smugly, believing they had the right to erase me from my own daughter's wedding day. "It would be best if you didn't even walk her down the aisle," Mrs. Thornfield added. "She deserves someone more respectable." I could have fought them. I could have demanded my rights as Emma's father. Instead, I did something that clearly surprised them. "You're absolutely right," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Emma deserves the very best on her wedding day." The three of them blinked in surprise. They'd been prepared for an argument, maybe even hoped for one so they could paint me as the difficult, lower-class father who didn't understand his place. "I'm glad you see it that way," Mr. Thornfield said, though he sounded slightly disappointed that he didn't get to deliver a more crushing blow. "Of course I do," I replied. "I want Emma to be proud of her wedding day. I want her to remember it as perfect." Mrs. Thornfield actually smiled, clearly pleased that I was being so cooperative about my own humiliation. "You're being very mature about this, Frank. Very understanding." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Emma will appreciate that you're putting her happiness first." They had no idea that my calm acceptance was hiding a storm that had been building for weeks. They thought they'd broken me, reduced me to a grateful shadow who was thankful just to be allowed in the building. Let them think that. Let them believe they'd won. Tomorrow, they would learn that they'd made a serious mistake in underestimating the man they'd tried so hard to erase. "I'll see you all tomorrow," I said, shaking hands with each of them like we'd just concluded a pleasant business meeting. "It's going to be a day none of us will ever forget." Wedding morning arrived with perfect weather and an air of excitement that I could feel even from my small apartment across town. I dressed carefully in my best suit. Not the expensive one the Thornfields didn't know I owned, but the simple dark suit they expected to see. Around 10 a.m., my phone started buzzing with texts from Emma's cousin Patricia. "There's someone important at the church. Nobody knows who invited them. The Thornfields are freaking out." Then another message. "A bunch of people in expensive cars just showed up. Mrs. Thornfield is running around trying to figure out who they are." I smiled as I finished my coffee. Phase 1 was beginning right on schedule. My phone rang Emma, sounding panicked. "Dad, there are all these people at the church and nobody knows who they are. Did you invite anyone without telling me?" "No, sweetheart. I kept to the list we agreed on." "That's what I told Marcus's mother. But she's convinced someone from your side made a mistake with the invitations." I could hear Mrs. Thornfield shrieking in the background about unauthorized guests and security issues. "Don't worry about it, Emma. Focus on getting ready. It's your big day." "You're right. I hope everything goes smoothly." "Oh, it will," I assured her. "Today is going to be absolutely unforgettable." After I hung up, I picked up the small locked case I'd been preparing for weeks. Everything I needed was inside, organized and ready for the moment when I would finally remind everyone exactly who they were dealing with. I arrived at the church early and took my assigned seat in the back, far from the Thornfields' important guests, exactly where they wanted me. From my position, I could see the confusion and concern on their faces as they tried to identify the mysterious VIPs who had somehow made it onto their exclusive guest list. Marcus was holding court with his groomsmen near the altar, his confidence restored now that the wedding day had arrived. I moved closer to hear what he was saying. Honestly, guys, I feel bad for Emma sometimes. He was telling his friends. She's worked so hard to fit into our world, but she's still carrying baggage from her old life. One of his friends glanced toward where I was supposed to be sitting. Her dad seems nice enough. Marcus laughed. He's harmless, I guess. But he's basically a nobody. Fixes air conditioners for a living, drives some beat-up truck, lives in a tiny apartment. After today, Emma will really belong to my family. She won't need to worry about those old connections anymore. Another groomsman joined the conversation. At least he's not walking her down the aisle. That would have been awkward for everyone. Thank God my mother handled that situation, Marcus replied. Emma deserves better than that embarrassment. They were all laughing now, talking about me like I was some pathetic charity case that Emma was finally getting rid of. I stood there quietly, letting them enjoy their last moments of ignorance. In a few hours, their laughter would turn to something very different. The music began, and I watched from my seat as the processional started. Emma's bridesmaids walked down the aisle, followed by the flower girl and ring bearer. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. Emma appeared at the back of the church, absolutely radiant in her wedding gown. She looked around nervously, clearly searching for me, but I wasn't where she expected me to be. Her uncle, the respectable Judge the Thornfields had chosen as my replacement, appeared at her side and offered his arm. Emma hesitated for just a moment, her eyes scanning the crowd until she found me sitting in the back row. Our eyes met across the church, and I saw confusion and something that might have been regret flash across her face. But then she composed herself, took her uncle's arm, and began the long walk down the aisle. The Thornfields were beaming with satisfaction. Their plan had worked perfectly. The embarrassing father had been removed from the ceremony, replaced by someone who properly represented their family's status and respectability. Mrs. Thornfield actually turned around and gave me a smug smile, like she was gloating over her victory. I nodded back politely, my hands resting calmly on the locked case beside me. Let her gloat. Let them all think they'd won. The real ceremony was about to begin. As the officiant began the wedding ceremony, I quietly rose from my seat and walked toward the side door of the church. Several people noticed my movement, but most assumed I was just stepping out for air or to the restroom. Instead, I made my way around to the main entrance and slipped back inside, positioning myself at the back of the church where I could see everything but remain relatively unnoticed. I was carrying the locked case now, and a few of the mysterious VIP guests, my guests, though nobody knew that yet, turned to nod at me respectfully. The Thornfields noticed this interaction and exchanged worried glances, clearly trying to figure out what was happening. Emma and Marcus were at the altar now, holding hands as the officiant talked about the sanctity of marriage and the joining of two families. Emma kept glancing back toward my original seat, clearly troubled that I wasn't where she expected me to be. Mrs. Thornfield leaned over to whisper something to her husband, probably instructing him to find out who these mystery guests were and why they seemed to know me. Marcus's groomsmen were starting to look uncomfortable too, sensing that something was different about the atmosphere in the church. The tension was building exactly as I'd planned. Soon, everyone in this church would understand that they had made a serious error in judgment about the father they tried so hard to erase. Just as the officiant was about to ask for the vows, Mrs. Thornfield suddenly stood up from her front row seat. The entire church fell silent as she turned to face the congregation. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the church. "But I think there's something everyone should understand about this union." Emma's face went pale. Marcus looked confused and alarmed. The officiant stepped back, clearly unsure how to handle this disruption. Mrs. Thornfield continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "This wedding represents more than just the love between two young people. It's the joining of families, the merging of different social circles." She gestured grandly toward her side of the church. "My family brings generations of success, education, and social standing to this union." Then she turned toward my side of the church, her expression shifting to one of disdain. "And while we're grateful for other contributions to Emma's upbringing, I think it's important that everyone understands exactly what kind of family background we're dealing with here. The gasps that erupted from the congregation were audible throughout the church. People were looking back and forth between Mrs. Thornfield and me, clearly shocked by her public attack. "This wedding unites us with a family of status," she declared, her voice rising with emotion. "Not with the poor embarrassment of a father who fixes air conditioners and drives a broken-down truck." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma stood at the altar, frozen between her uncle and Marcus, her face cycling through emotions I'd never seen before. The wedding dress that had made her look so radiant now seemed to weigh her down as she stared at her soon-to-be mother-in-law in horror. "Mrs. Thornfield," the officiant began, clearly trying to restore order to the ceremony. But Emma found her voice first. "What are you doing?" she whispered, though her words carried clearly in the silent church. Mrs. Thornfield turned back to face her. "I'm protecting my son's future, dear. Protecting our family's reputation. Some truths need to be spoken openly." Emma's eyes found mine across the crowded church. For the first time in months, I saw the little girl I'd raised looking back at me, confused, hurt, and suddenly ashamed not of me, but of what was happening around her. "This is supposed to be my wedding day," Emma said, her voice growing stronger. "It is your wedding day," Mrs. Thornfield replied. "The day you join a family that can give you the life you deserve. The day you leave behind other influences that might hold you back." Marcus was trying to get his mother to sit down, but she brushed him off. The mysterious VIP guests I'd invited were watching the scene unfold with expressions that ranged from disgust to fascination. The tension in the church had reached a breaking point. Emma was torn between the shame she'd felt about me and the humiliation of watching her future mother-in-law attack her father publicly. For the first time in months, the real tension wasn't hidden behind polite dinner conversations and whispered comments. It was right there in the open for everyone to see. I stood up from my position at the back of the church and began walking down the aisle, carrying the locked case in my hands. Every eye in the building followed my movement as I made my way toward the altar. "I think," I said, my voice calm but carrying clearly through the silent church, "that it's time for some truth." Mrs. Thornfield's face went from smug satisfaction to alarm as she realized I wasn't retreating in shame. Emma watched me approach, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. When I reached the front of the church, I set the case down on a nearby table and opened it deliberately, letting everyone see that I'd come prepared for this moment. Inside were property deeds, business documents, financial statements, and a thick envelope with Emma's name written on it in my handwriting. But those weren't the most important contents. "For months," I said, addressing the entire congregation, "I've listened to speculation about who I am, what I'm worth, whether I'm good enough to be Emma's father." I pulled out the first set of documents. "These are the property deeds for the buildings that house Thompson Air Conditioning and Heating, a business I built from nothing over the past 20 years. Murmurs rippled through the church as people began to understand that there was more to the story than they'd been told. "This business currently employs 43 people and services commercial accounts throughout the state." Mrs. Thornfield's face had gone completely white. I continued pulling documents from the case, laying them out methodically for everyone to see. "These are investment statements showing the portfolio I've been building since Emma was born," I said, holding up several pages of financial records. "Every penny I earned that didn't go to her education or our daily expenses went into securing her future." The numbers were significant enough that several people in the front rows leaned forward to get a better look. "This is the deed to the lake house I bought last year. The one Emma doesn't know about because I wanted it to be a wedding gift." Emma's hand flew to her mouth as she stared at the document. "And this," I said, pulling out a thick folder, "is the documentation showing that I've already paid for Emma's future children's college educations, including trust funds that will mature when they turn 18. The church was completely silent now, everyone processing the revelation that the embarrassing father they'd been dismissing was actually quite successful. "You see," I said, looking directly at Mrs. Thornfield, "I never felt the need to flash my wealth or use it to buy respect. I built my business quietly, invested carefully, and focused on being the best father I could be. I turned to address Emma directly. I kept my success quiet because I wanted you to love me for who I was, not what I could buy you. I wanted to teach you that a person's worth comes from their character, not their bank account. The envelope with Emma's name fell open, revealing photographs from throughout her childhood, pictures of us together, happy and proud of each other. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out another folder, this one thicker and more ominous looking than the others. While I was working those late nights that everyone assumed meant I was sulking, I said, my voice taking on a harder edge, I was actually doing research, background checks, financial investigations, public record searches. Mrs. Thornfield tried to interrupt, but I continued speaking. It turns out that the Thornfield family's business empire isn't quite as solid as they'd like everyone to believe. I opened the folder and began reading from the documents inside. 3 pending lawsuits for breach of contract. 2 federal investigations into tax evasion. A bankruptcy filing that was quietly settled last year to avoid public embarrassment. Gasps erupted throughout the church. Marcus had gone pale, and his father was trying to signal for me to stop. The lake house development that was supposedly such a success? It was built on illegally obtained wetlands, and the EPA is preparing to file charges. I looked directly at Mrs. Thornfield, whose smugness had been completely replaced by panic. The successful family that my daughter was marrying into is actually facing financial ruin and potential criminal charges. Marcus finally found his voice. That's not true. Those are lies. These are public records, I replied calmly, available to anyone who knows where to look and cares enough to check. The mysterious VIP guests, who I now revealed were investigators, lawyers, and journalists I'd invited, were taking notes and recording everything. Marcus grabbed his mother's arm, his composure finally cracking completely. Mom, what is he talking about? You said those problems were resolved. Mrs. Thornfield tried to maintain her dignity, but the panic in her eyes was unmistakable. Marcus, don't listen to him. He's just trying to ruin your wedding day out of spite. Actually, Marcus said, his voice rising with fear, some of this sounds familiar. Remember those meetings you and Dad had with lawyers last month? The ones you said were just routine business. The truth was starting to pour out now, and Marcus was realizing that his perfect family wasn't what it seemed. You knew about this? Emma asked, staring at her fiancé with growing horror. Marcus's face crumpled. Some of it. But Mom said it was just temporary setbacks. She said marrying you would help stabilize our position because... He stopped mid-sentence, realizing what he was about to admit. Because what? Emma demanded. Because she thought your father was poor, Marcus whispered. She thought marrying you would give us access to your inheritance eventually, and it would look good for the family to be seen as generous, marrying below our station. The confession hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Emma stared at Marcus, then at his mother, then at me. You were marrying me for money that you thought I didn't have, while looking down on my father, who you didn't know actually had more than your family? The irony was devastating, and everyone in the church could see it. Emma's eyes filled with tears as the full weight of everything crashed down on her. She looked at Marcus, at his panicking family, then at me standing there with the evidence of their deception spread out for everyone to see. Oh my God! She whispered, her voice breaking. What have I done? She turned to face me fully, and I saw my little girl looking back at me. Not the ashamed young woman who'd been hiding me from her new social circle, but the daughter I'd raised to value honesty and integrity above everything else. Dad? She said, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. I was so worried about fitting into their world that I forgot who I really was. I forgot who raised me to be better than this. She stepped away from Marcus, who was still arguing with his mother about how much of their financial trouble he'd known about. I let them make me ashamed of you, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger even as the tears continued to fall. I let them convince me that your love, your sacrifices, your character didn't matter as much as their money and their status. She looked around the church at all the guests who were watching this drama unfold. My father worked 3 jobs to put me through college. He drove a 15-year-old truck so I could have a new car. He lived in a tiny apartment so he could save money for my future. Her voice cracked with emotion. And I repaid him by being embarrassed of him, by hiding him away like he was something shameful instead of someone I should have been proud of. Marcus tried to approach her, but she stepped back. The shame was never his, she said, looking directly at me. It was mine, for abandoning the man who loved me unconditionally. Before anyone could respond, one of my invited guests stood up from his seat in the middle of the church. Judge Harrison Wallace, a man I'd known for 25 years and one of the most respected legal minds in the state, cleared his throat. "If I may," he said, his voice carrying the authority that came from decades on the bench, "I believe there are some legal matters that need to be addressed here." Marcus and his family turned pale. They recognized Judge Wallace, even if they didn't understand why he was there. Based on the evidence presented here today, Judge Wallace continued, "It appears there may have been fraudulent intent in this marriage contract. The groom's family has misrepresented their financial status, and there's evidence of criminal activity that could affect the legal validity of any union." He pulled out his own documents. "Furthermore, I'm required to report potential fraud to the appropriate authorities, which means this ceremony cannot proceed until these matters are resolved." Emma looked confused. "Judge Wallace, I don't understand." "What I'm saying, Emma," the judge replied kindly, "is that this wedding cannot legally continue. There are too many questions about the groom's family's intentions and their ability to enter into a valid marriage contract." Mrs. Thornfield finally found her voice. "You can't do this. This is a church, not a courtroom." "Actually," Judge Wallace replied, "as an ordained minister as well as a judge, I have the authority to stop any ceremony where I have reason to believe fraud is involved." He looked directly at Marcus. "Son, you and your family need to speak with some lawyers. Very good lawyers." The wedding was officially over. What happened next was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Emma dropped her bouquet and ran straight toward me, not caring about her expensive dress or the hundreds of people watching. She threw her arms around me and held on tight, crying like she was 5 years old and I was the only person in the world who could make everything better. "Dad," she sobbed against my chest, "please forgive me. I'm so sorry. I lost myself trying to be someone I'm not, and I almost lost the most important person in my life." I held my daughter close, feeling the weight of months of hurt and humiliation finally lifting from my shoulders. "There's nothing to forgive, sweetheart," I whispered in her ear. "You're my daughter, and I love you no matter what." The congregation erupted in applause. People were actually cheering as they watched this reunion, understanding that they'd witnessed something real and powerful. Mrs. Thornfield and her family were pushing their way toward the exit, followed by reporters and investigators who wanted to ask them questions about the evidence I'd presented. Marcus tried to approach Emma one more time, but she turned away from him and stayed in my arms. "Dad," she said, pulling back to look at me, "will you walk me out of here? I think I need to go home and remember who I really am." I offered her my arm, and together we walked down the aisle past all the guests who were now looking at me with respect instead of pity. As we reached the church doors, Emma stopped and looked back at the chaos behind us. "I'm not ashamed of you, Dad," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm proud to be your daughter." We walked out into the sunshine together, finally free from the lies and pretensions that had nearly destroyed our relationship. The father who had been silenced was now standing proud, not just as a successful businessman, but as the hero of his daughter's story.